Okay, well, good evening and welcome to the Institute for Government. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Akash Pal and I'm a fellow here at the Institute, and really delighted to be chairing tonight's discussion about Scotland's referendum and the future of the UK. Very pleased to welcome our panel. You may notice we are one panellist short from the advertised event. Perhaps ironically, it's our London-based speaker who's been unable to make it, but not for travel-related reasons. So Fraser Nelson unfortunately had to withdraw. But we have an excellent panel, so those who I'll introduce briefly. To my left, Professor Ian McLean of Oxford University, and the co-author of Scotland's Choices, the referendum and what happens afterwards. Excellent book that I've just finished reading, which talks through the various options facing Scotland in the event of either a yes or a no vote in the referendum of next September. And Ian will be speaking first. Following Ian McLean, we have Ian McWhirter sitting to my right, who also has a book recently out on the subject, Road to Referendum, which was accompanied, I understand, by a documentary series of the same name. Ian writes mainly now, I think, for the Herald and Sunday Herald, but he has a long career in journalism, both in Scotland and as a former lobby journalist at Westminster. And then finally, Leslie Riddoch, also with a book. I should hasten to add, none of them asked me specifically to promote their books, but I thought it was the right thing to do. So Leslie's book, Blossom, What Scotland Needs to Flourish, recently published. And Leslie also has a long career in journalism, including for the BBC, and writes currently for The Scotsman. Leslie also is a founder of Nordic Horizons, a think tank based in Edinburgh that seeks to draw lessons from Scandinavian countries in terms of policy and governance approaches. So I'm very grateful to the three speakers for joining us, and thanks to all of you to making it out through the weather as well. I'm going to ask each of the speakers to speak initially for around 10 minutes before we open it up to questions. The event is all on the record, and if anyone would like to tweet, there is a hashtag of IndieRef up on the screen. So that's enough for me, and I'll hand over to Ian to start the proceedings.
Thank you very much, Akash. So I just want to present some very basic data to kick off my 10 minutes. This and the next slide come from Scottish Social Attitudes, who know what they're talking about. It's the best survey series in Scotland, and it has run for some 20 years now, so they've had an opportunity to ask the same questions every year. I could spend much more than my 10 minutes just on Scottish Social Attitudes, but I highlight two things only. This one reports a three-way choice that they have offered since 1997. Would you prefer Scotland to be independent, which is the blue? Is there a clicker on this? Yeah, the blue line. Or for there to be no Scottish Parliament, the green, or a Scottish Parliament with some powers short of independence. So the trend is, by the standards of these things, amazingly stable. Scottish Parliament, but short of independence, is always the most popular option, and sometimes often with more than half of the votes. Scottish independence reached its highest point in the series in 1999, just as the Scottish Parliament was being set up. It's pretty stable. It's not at all changed in 2007, when the first SNP government is elected, a minority government that actually features a low in the pro-independence series, and an inconsequential increase with the majority SNP government in 2011, followed again by a decrease. don't pay much attention to the individual numbers. The long-term stability is the takeaway point. That there should be no Scottish Parliament at all was at its peak popularity before there was one in 1907. Now that there is one, people seem to accept it. So there's the very stable situation. Scottish people like devolution. I think there's not much point in asking a public opinion sample how much devolution you would like, because it's an obscure issue, and it's one of these questions which, as my colleague John Kay likes to say, is comparable to asking a sample of the public, would you like £5? The answer tends to be yes. However, here's another fact, also from Scottish Social Attitudes. So it's the same series, asking the same respondents over the same time period, do you consider yourselves equally British and Scottish, more Scottish than British, more British than Scottish? That question comes in various formats. Here's the simplest version. If you're forced to give just one of the two answers, Scottish or British, overwhelmingly people in Scotland say Scottish, the blue. So take these two facts together. And as I say, these are samples, this is the same people answering both questions. Since devolution short of independence is by far the most popular, with more than half of the Scottish people, since Scottish rather than British enforced choice is a 70-30 preference, it follows arithmetically that there must be at least some people who think of themselves as Scottish but not British, but who are opposed to Scottish independence. And that is the situation that part of the situation that the SNP government of Scotland is in. It is by far the most popular political party, and I'm not predicting that it will lose the Scottish Parliament at the next Scottish Parliament election in 2016, but the central plank of its policy is not supported by, it's not even supported by more than half of its own voters. So the fact that it will have that we will have a referendum, I think, arises from the fact that nobody, including the SNP, expected the SNP to have a majority in the current Scottish Parliament. Its majority is a result of Donald Dewar, who created the Scottish Parliament, failing to anticipate that it was possible that a party could win a majority of seats on a minority of votes, even with proportional representation, which is what happened at the last election. The election having delivered an SNP majority, the SNP, of course, had to deliver on its promise to deliver a referendum, and that's what we're here to discuss. So I will very quickly go through yes and no with just one set of talking points on each. There are the four most interesting issues that I think that arise if the people say yes. The first one actually is an issue whether the people say yes or no, and it is making the Scottish Parliament fiscally responsible. At present, the Scottish Parliament and the Welsh and Northern Irish spend, but they do not tax. Politicians really love that. They enjoy spending, they do not enjoy taxing. Consequence is, and I'll be very blunt on this, a complete political irresponsibility by all parties in Scotland. All the manifestos in the 2011 and previous Scottish elections said, we will spend more than that lot on things that people want. Not a single manifesto, with a very, very qualified exception of the Conservative one, said, oh, and by the way, somebody has to pay for it. So we have a fiscally irresponsible Parliament. Clearly, if the people vote yes, Parliament has to be fiscally responsible. And that, I think, is unambiguously a good thing. Second point, and what seems to be the most powerful bargaining counter in the event of a yes vote. Faslane and Coalport. I don't have the map up, which I usually use to illustrate this. Those of you who know Scotland will know that the HM Naval Base Clyde, that is the nuclear-powered and nuclear-armed submarine force, and the Warhead Store are berthed and stored in two adjacent fjords, the Gairloch and Loch Long, on the west coast of Scotland, about 30 miles from Glasgow. You can't move them, not in less than a large number of years and a large number of billions of pounds. If Scotland cannot be, even if it wanted, which the present Scottish Government does not, it cannot be a nuclear power under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. The Gairloch and Loch Long are less than a mile wide, which means that everything, including the approaches to the berths, are in Scottish territorial waters. There is therefore an extremely difficult problem here, and I think the first reaction of the Scottish Government in any negotiations is going to be to say to the UK Government, this is your problem. And at least in the first round of discussions, I think that's going to be a powerful point. The other two issues, I think, are much more difficult for the Scottish Government. Let's assume it's the current Scottish Government which is negotiating independence. EU membership, as some of you may know, the Scottish Government breezily gave the impression that not only that Scotland would automatically continue as an EU member, but that they had legal advice to that effect. When some dogged FOI people said, we want to see your legal advice, the Scottish Government refused. They went to the Information Commissioner. The Commissioner said, produce it. It then turned out that it didn't exist. So it's now, however reluctantly, accepted that Scotland would be an applicant, no doubt a fast-track applicant, and the EU would not throw out 5 million of its existing citizens. But I need only say Spain to indicate that negotiations will not be necessarily straightforward and that Scotland would, I think, not get EU membership on the current UK terms. I want to make your flesh creep by posing the following nightmare. In 2014, Scotland votes yes. As a consequence, probably there are no Scottish MPs in the UK Parliament elected in 2015. As a further consequence, it's easier for the Conservatives to win an overall majority. As a further consequence, David Cameron then gets to, or has to, implement his election promise to hold a referendum on EU membership for the rest of the UK. The people vote no to the EU. You then have Scotland in, rest of the UK out. Does Scotland join the Schengen area? There are two possible answers. They're mutually exclusive and jointly exhaustive, and they're both horrible. I won't give any more details, I'll just let people think about that. On currency, I'm moving very fast. There are three options, and none of them is particularly attractive, or 3.5. One is Euro membership, which used to be SNP policy. For very obvious reasons, it's been dropped. However, EU negotiations might lead to other partners saying you've got to join the Eurozone. I don't think that's actually a constraint because they said that to the Czechs. And I teach this stuff in Charles University. I asked my Czech students what probability was it that the Czech Republic would adopt the euro anytime soon, and the modal answer was 0. So adopting the euro, not on. Adopting sterling has recently produced the riposte from the UK government that if you adopt sterling and you make the Bank of England your central bank, it'll be on our terms, and we will dictate the terms. To which I think Scottish Government can say, you're a bloody load of hypocrites. You're trying to impose terms on us that you would not impose on yourselves, which is a fair point. But in this hypothetical negotiation, the UK government would have the whip hand. The Scottish government, I think, would have no powers except to say, OK, now let's talk about these submarines. Third option, which people are just beginning to canvass, is a floating currency with an independent central bank. And some economists think that might be the most sensible option. OK, if the people say no, first point to make is that there's something out there that Ian and Leslie and I all care about, and almost nobody in Scotland does, which is the Kalman Report and the Scotland Act 2012. This is a set of proposals which come in by default if the answer is no, and they go some way already to making the Scottish Parliament fiscally responsible, because the Cunning Plan, and I claim a bit of authorship because I was a member of a Kalman working group, is that at the margin you make the Scottish Parliament fiscally responsible by the UK withdrawing from 10 pence of the pound of income tax, and the Scottish Parliament has to set a rate. It could be 11p, it could be 10p, it could be 9p, but at the margin it would have to measure its taxing against its spending, which it doesn't at present. It's very popular to say, Carmen is old hat, we need more devolution, we need devolution max. That's easy to say. My cynical opinion is a lot of that is cheap talk by people who've not studied the issues. And the best way to, I think, make people think about it is not to say what spending areas would you like to be devolved, but what taxes would you like to devolve, because it's only the other side of the same question. And that takes you very quickly to the fact that there's, of the big taxes, there's one that you cannot devolve under EU law, and that's VAT. You could hand over the proceeds of VAT in Scotland to the Scottish Government, and there's a good case for doing that. That's called assignment, but you cannot devolve it. You can't vary the rate. You could devolve corporation tax, but that is the most brain-dead idea I have ever heard in public policy in recent years, and if anybody doesn't understand why, consider the recent witness session with the heads of Amazon, Google, and Starbucks, and imagine what they would do were corporation tax to vary within the UK. So if you can't devolve two of the only three big taxes that there are, other than income tax, the only one that you can devolve is national insurance contributions. And there's a case for that, I think quite a good case, but it comes with an implication. And the implication is that if it's for the Scottish Parliament to set national insurance rates, then national insurance rates may vary, and benefits may vary within the United Kingdom. And people might say this is a good idea. They might, on the other hand, say, oh yes, I'm all for devolution max, but I didn't mean that. In which case, it's not clear what the content of devolution max actually is. And very finally, the most familiar of all, especially in this room, the famous West Lothian question. If there is more devolution short of independence, what happens to Scottish MPs at Westminster? Very hurriedly, there are, I think, two possible answers. One in the recent Mackay Commission, which was a parliamentary commission looking at ways to implement English votes on English laws. I see that the most eminent person in the UK on the subject of English votes and English laws is in the room. He knows that I don't think it quite works, and we can have a civilized argument about that. I don't think it works in the Mackay implementation either. On this matter, I disagree with my co-author Jim Gallagher, who thinks you can make English votes on English laws work. I think you can't, and therefore my solution to the West Lothian question would be to reduce the numbers, but not the powers, of Scottish MPs. So that's points I would like to put on the table.
Thank you very much. Okay, so without any hesitation, hand over to Ian McWhirter.
Indeed, well, thank you very much, Akash, and to the Institute for inviting us down here for this event. I was very pleased to discover that London, the city of my birth, is still here and hasn't been blown into the Atlantic by Hurricane St. Jude. Now, St. Jude, of course, is the patron saint of lost causes, and it has to be said at the moment that the independence campaign in Scotland may be consulting him for his services, because things, as we've been hearing, have not been going particularly well for the Yes campaign. But bear in mind that hurricanes can happen, as Michael Fish discovered in 1987, and they can come and develop very fast. And we haven't really seen a political engagement yet in Scotland on this whole issue. Forgive me for looking at my phone. It's not that I'm expecting a call or anything like that. It's just that's got my notes, such as they are, on it, and I can't actually find them anymore. Also, I'm also not doing a live Twitter feed as I speak, but don't laugh, that could happen. Now, I've been asked to talk about the implications of a yes vote and the implications of a no vote in Scotland. But first of all, I think it's important to stress the extent to which Scotland has already diverged in terms of political culture, in terms of the organisation of public services, and in terms of the general character of Scottish society, because it has changed very dramatically, not just in terms of the obvious legislative changes that have come with the Scottish Parliament, the abolition of university tuition fees, the implementation of the Sutherland reports, Sutherland Commission's reports, recommendations on personal care, prescription charges and issues like that. These are the most obvious ones. But the divergence is much greater, I think, in terms of the philosophy of public service provision in Scotland. In Scotland, you still have a National Health Service, which remains the top-down monopoly that Tony Blair used to get so worked up about and was so upset about, that's being reformed south of the border by market-based reforms which are being completely rejected in Scotland and have no constituency there. There's been no moves to open up the GP's practices to private sector companies. And the same applies to education. The comprehensive education system is unchallenged in Scotland, outside small enclaves in big cities like Edinburgh, where there's a small handful of private schools. There's universal, almost universal acceptance of the maintenance of the comprehensive system. So you've got no beacon schools, specialist schools, city academies. You don't have any free schools coming north of the border. This is quite strange in some ways, because in Scotland there was quite a long tradition of free schools, radical free schools like A.S. Neil's Summerhill, which employed very advanced and very unorthodox educational techniques. But there's been no move to emulate the free school movement north of the border. So you have the bog standard comprehensive, as Alistair Campbell called them, and they are accepted north of the border. So that you get an indication of the extent to which the texture of Scottish society has changed. And it's changed very much in terms of its political culture as well. There is no UKIP in Scotland, despite Nigel Farage's highly publicised visits to Scotland, one of which led him to being chased into an Edinburgh pub by anti-racism campaigners. They lost a deposit in Dunfermline and they're making no impact whatsoever. As far as the Conservative Party, it's almost ceased to function as a serious political organisation north of the border. As we like to say, there are more giant pandas in Scotland than there are Tory MPs. There's only one Tory MP north of the border, and that's unlikely to change. So you have a political culture dominated by two broadly left of centre social democratic parties who are competing for very similar territory. And this means that on the issue of Europe, for example, there is not the antagonism to Europe, the visceral antagonism to Europe that you feel whenever you come down to London, that I feel whenever I speak to Tory MPs. There don't seem to be Eurosceptics and Europhiles any longer. There are only Eurosceptics on the Tory benches, and you don't get that opposition to Europe north of the border. So, whatever happens, I think you've got to accept that Scotland is moving in a very different direction. Anyone who's familiar, and I'm sure Leslie will talk about this, anyone who's familiar with Denmark or Norway or Scandinavian countries will know how Scotland feels. It feels more like that. There's much flatter, much less inequality of income and wealth north of the border. House prices are very much lower than they are down here. There's not the same competitive atmosphere. So what happens? We have this referendum, which actually nobody wanted, not even the SNP. I mean, it was a freak of politics, a freak of the electoral system that allowed the SNP in an additional member system, a proportional system, to get a majority of MPs. No one expected that this was possible. People like me were saying it wasn't possible at all. And in fact, the very system of election for the Scottish Parliament was devised precisely so that the SNP would not get an absolute majority. So no one expected it to happen. But the SNP delivered this, and therefore it had to implement its referendum at a time which was very difficult for Scots. Because unlike in Ireland, as my book explores, there's no real history of political nationalism north of the border for very important historical reasons, because Scotland was much more integrated with the UK and was very much sold into the joint enterprise of the British Empire in a way that Ireland never was. So it's not that Scotland is kind of coming to an Irish situation 100 years late. There was never the same tradition of political nationalism north of the border. Nevertheless, we are faced with this referendum, and Scots have to make something of it. As we know at the moment, opposition to independence is about 2 to 1. It's about support for independence varies from about 25% to 30%. It's very rarely any higher than that in Scotland. And that is obviously given a great deal of heart to the Unionists in Scotland. Ian Davidson, the Labour MP, has said the battle is already won. All that's left is to go around and bayonet the wounded. So I think it gives a kind of indication of what would happen after a no vote. But if there's a yes vote, what happens then? Well, I don't think actually there would be all that much change. You've got to remember that the Scottish Parliament already has control over the vast area of domestic legislation, education, health, criminal justice, and the rest of it. As we've heard from Ian, taxation is actually being devolved quite significantly already. Income tax is going to be sort of divided. Scots will have the latitude to vary 10 pence in the standard rate of income tax, which is supposed to make the Parliament more responsible. I think people will eventually say, well, you don't really make a parliament half responsible. That doesn't make a lot of sense. So you'll devolve income tax and various other taxes. And I think ultimately Scotland would argue for a share of oil revenues. But that's another issue altogether. So if there's a yes and Scotland votes for independence, what will change? Well, the currency will remain the pound. There will be no constituency for joining the euro or for a separate Scottish currency. And the pressure for that will come not from Scotland, but from England. The Bank of England will not want Scotland to have a separate currency. It will not want companies which straddle the border to have to undergo all the financial costs, transaction costs, every time they move goods to and from Gretna Green. So that's not going to happen. The banks will be lobbying the government very assiduously against there being, against George Osborne's threat that Scotland would be denied the use of the pound. Possibly the most ludicrous proposition that has been uttered in the debate so far. That will certainly never happen. The Scottish banks, people talk about RBS being Scotland's biggest bank. Well, RBS is also England's biggest bank. Most of its operations are south of the border in the NatWest, and it will certainly lobby very hard against it being a separate Scottish currency. So I think that will not happen either. As we've been hearing also with the EU, Scotland will remain in Europe. I can't see any prospect of Scotland being denied membership of the European Union when it's been under the aegis of European law for the last 20 years, European Union law for the last 22 years. I can't see any circumstances under which Scotland would be denied continued membership of the European Union. And if it was, there would be an outcry from all these Eastern European countries and Baltic states who, of course, had to leave the Soviet Union so that they could join the EU in the first place. I don't think there's any prospect. There would be negotiations and horse trading, of course. That's what Europe is all about. But I think that horse trading and negotiation might apply south of the border as well, because if the UK loses a third of its land mass, its nuclear weapons, and its hydrocarbon resources, there will be implications, I think, for the voting strength of the UK on the Council of Ministers, and also there will be questions about the UK's contribution to the EU budget. And as we know from his own, what he said himself, David Cameron's even worried about the UK retaining its seat in the Security Committee of the United Nations. So I don't think very much is going to change if there's a yes vote. Certainly on the surface of things, things will continue pretty much as they are, even in defence, because now that the SNP very controversially has signed up to NATO, I think that signals that nuclear weapons will probably remain in the Clyde for some time. A compromise deal would be reached, I suggest, under which the boats would probably stay there. The nuclear missiles, the weapons, which have to come down to the Atomic Weapons Establishment in Aldermaston every year anyway, would be kept down here, and there would be some deal under which that could be maintained. So not too much change if there's a yes. What happens if there's a no? Well, there could be some changes then, actually. I think probably the West Lothian question would become an issue because, for the reasons that Ian has mentioned there, that Scotland is arguably overrepresented in the House of Commons, and there would be pressure to reduce the number of MPs. I mean, there was ideas floated by George Fawkes and a number of other Labour MPs that you should reform the UK's constitution, that you should turn the House of Lords into a Senate and have federalism all round and have a federal constitution. That certainly was an option. Perhaps still is an option now. Would be a very good idea, but there's absolutely no interest or enthusiasm for it in Westminster, so it's just not going to happen. So we'll continue to muddle along. Scotland will have greater financial powers, economic powers, as we've been hearing under the Scotland Act. I think, though, there will be other changes because of this, and I'll finish in this, that what we have in Scotland is not so much asymmetrical federalism as what people talk about, it's anomalous federalism. Because you have Scotland, the Parliament, which has primary legislation, makes its own laws in a whole range of areas. Only in areas that are specified to Westminster does it not have powers to legislate. So things like press regulation, for example, when people were looking at Leveson, somebody asked the question, well, who has responsibility for the press in Scotland? Nobody knew, because it's not written down anywhere. But because it's not specified that press regulation is a Westminster responsibility, it is assumed to be a Scottish responsibility, and therefore that has been assumed by the Scottish Government, the Scottish Parliament. I think that there will be pressure for that to change. I don't think Westminster will be happy with that continued anomaly. And I think there'll be pressure to roll back a number of these areas in which Scotland has significantly moved and departed from UK norms, particularly, as I said, in the provision of public services. I think there'll be pressure to open up the National Health Service to competition from private firms, as there has been south of the border. And this is already, in a sense, in train, because the Labour Party in Scotland, which has, as I said, has already declared victory in the referendum, has set up this, what's being called the Cuts Commission. It's a review of all these supposed spending freebies that have been introduced by the SNP over the years. That's tuition fees and elderly care prescription charges. And the proposal is that these would be rolled back. And I think Westminster MPs would say, OK, Scots have voted no. That means you're staying in the UK. It's a unitary state. So the implication of that is that you don't have the latitude to have these very different methods of public provision. So I think the conclusion is the more things change, the more they remain the same. Nice.
Well, thanks very much, Ian. No, very interested by your, well, actually, it sounded like you were suggesting possibly a no vote would lead to more changes over the longer run than a yes vote would. Yeah. So interested to come back to that in discussion. And very pleased to welcome our third speaker, Leslie Riddoch.
Yes, well, I suppose I'd actually agree with that analysis from Ian there, because in a sense, the Scots have always been the tail that cannot wag the dog. And I mean, given our mutual size, we kind of understand that. I got involved in a ferocious Twitter storm 2 weeks ago when I came down to London. Took a picture of a sign at Liverpool Street Station saying Scottish notes cannot be used in this machine. And I kind of thought, do you know, I'm just so weary of coming down and finding this difficulty. Because, you know, if you accept the reality of the United Kingdom, and this is kind of more important than just worrying about notes, the reality of the United Kingdom is that it is made of 4 nations. The state of the United Kingdom is made up of nations. Now, this is an important distinction because it explains in a way why the Scots can score in any kind of measurement extraordinarily high feelings of nationhood. I mean, Scots feel Scottishness more than any other part of the United Kingdom feels its national identity. But more than that, the Scots feel more Scottish than the Catalans feel Catalonish, the Quebecs feel Quebecish. The Scots are kind of fairly off the Richter scale for feeling Scottish. But that doesn't necessarily, that's a cultural thing, and it's also something, as Ian mentioned, which is about a Scottish way of doing things. Now, this didn't just breach in with devolution in the late 1990s. There's been a Scottish way of doing things. I've demonstrated part of it. The language has been different. Our law has been different. We went into the Union not as equals, but as a nation whose aspects of whose institutions remained intact. So outlooks about education, a broader base of education with that 4-year degree, a sort of Gadesian theory of having a lad of Perts, somebody who was going to be more of a kind of generalist than a specialist. These things have sat within, perhaps screened by a kind of, to my mind, fairly hollow Britishness actually. But these aspects of Scottish ways of doing things have sat beneath. So with devolution, they've kind of come out a wee bit, but maybe not very forcefully. And all of that is what makes people feel Scottish. I mean, I didn't actually know Ian was born in London. I was born in Wolverhampton, which I also didn't know until I was 11 in Belfast, which was a kind of cute place to learn that you weren't Irish. And a cute time too in the 1970s, we'd have to add. So, you know, this is not about ethnicity. And this is very often where there's a kind of misunderstanding. And again, in terms of the current debate, a kind of fairly inauthentic exchange where, from the unionist point of view, very often what comes into public debate is a kind of emotional appeal to not be distanced from your colleagues or your cousins in Wolverhampton or London or wherever else. And that to an extent, rings very hollow north of the border, because that's not really what this is about. The folk who will vote in the Scottish referendum are not ethnic Scots. Fraser Nelson, if he were here, has been dispossessed by his decision to live in London. It's about, so have you, Ian. So it's about who lives in Scotland. It's who's there. So having said all of that, the question for Scots is not really anything to do with how Scottish people feel. That's established. It's whether or not we want a Scottish state. It's whether we want to take those feelings of national identity, whether they're enough to create a state. And naturally then, attention focuses on all the mechanics of the state, which are defence, currency, and so on, because they're, and tax collecting. Naturally too, there's not as much emotion attached to the state until you get a dodgy tax bill, because it doesn't evoke the same sorts of feelings as those other things which attend to a national identity. So the question for Scots is, and building on what Ian had said there, is that we have sort of established a different way of doing things, but referring to the first Ian, it has been in a sort of bit of a kind of infantile bubble, to the degree that, yep, we can decide how to spend things, but true, we don't have to raise any of those taxes ourselves. Now, this is a kind of pocket money experience that we all, having been human and teenagers, understand. Much as you would like to have control over everything, you kind of dread the day, actually, that somebody hasn't already paid for your rent. But that day comes. And I wonder, when we're looking to the future, there's a very vigorous debate north of the border. I mean, Ian and I were smiling when we saw the hashtag IndieRef, because it's one that we use every waking day of our lives. We are weltered by the IndieRef and have been since, well, before everything kicked off last year. It's very hard to see how a lot of the ideas can be put back in the box, particularly because some people like myself are quite responsible for trying to kick yet more out. Ian was talking about the horror of imagining a Scotland which was in Europe whilst England had voted to be out. About as horrific, probably, as travelling from Norway to Sweden, I would imagine. And I quite get that, you know, there's been a totally different experience of the Nordic nations going in different directions. But as somebody who was actually brought up in Belfast, thinking I was Irish until that strange moment, I think what sits at the back of a lot of people's thinking is the only template we have, which is the Irish independence struggle, and it wasn't good. It was inconclusive, bloody, and horrible. I don't think any Irish folk would want to come, no offence folks, but kind of back into the tent, but I don't think anybody would have wanted it to work the way it did. Now, because we have been so intent on looking at large comparators at Germany, although Germany is not a bad one to look at because it has substantially powerful, normal tax-raising powers in its lender, we haven't looked at the small neighbouring countries of the Nordics who just keep doing damnably well. They do make up most of the AAA rated nations, despite the fact Canada and Germany are more often quoted. They do manage to cooperate quite easily. But here's a big difference. They did, in the case of Norway, have almost a century of powerful tax-raising legislative devolution before they became independent. In effect, they were already independent. When, in 1905, the final moment came in a spat over consular representation for Norway, the King of Sweden was so astonished that the Norwegians wanted out that he insisted on a referendum. And the result was 322,000 for independence, 184 against. That was only men who could vote. Women's suffragettes organised their own ballot and came up with 284,000 for and only a handful against. Shortly after that, in 1912, Norway became the first country to give women the vote. So there was no hesitation. Equally, when Iceland went for it in 1944, crazy, barking, fabulous little island, 250,000 people lost in the Arctic on an island upon which a third of all the lava flows on Earth have flowed, these folk decided they wanted to go it alone because Mother Denmark was occupied by Germany. And again, there wasn't a moment's hesitation. They had fairly strong devolution from the mid-1800s onwards. So in a way, as Ian was saying earlier, Scotland doesn't really kind of fit any particular template of what has come before, but it fits Ireland as little as it fits Norway. That's to say, there's no reason this should be Armageddon. What is the truth is that whether it's of interest here or not, there is a Scottish way of doing things. It is there in the same way as our banknotes are in my pocket. Now, I can just keep using plastic, standing queues, understand that in this country, winner takes all, size matters, and there is nothing but one way of doing things, which to a lot of the Celtic cousins in this United Kingdom is increasingly archaic and not fit for purpose, where London-centric policies are fed and flushed through an entire English system which can't cope with it. I was on the panel on any questions in Rothbury 2 weeks ago, and there was a very keen interest, to put it mildly, up in Northumberland about Scottish independence. The question was couched, if you vote yes, can we come too? Which surprised me. But there's, I think, a growing recognition within England that measures which have been adopted, debatably, to sort out overheating in the southeast, are being drunk like Kool-Aid right through the body of England, where those policies may actually be completely inappropriate. Now, the Scots, seems to me, have been structural thinkers. Our thoughts about trying to change things that go wrong very regularly run to trying to change structures. At the risk of sounding cheeky, it strikes me that here there's a belief in changing people, not structures. A different government will do the trick. A different set of types of politicians, like even UKIP, will do the trick. I find that puzzling. And looking at modern North European social democracies, or those which teeter around that description, there are a lot of characteristics there which leave the current UK as the odd ones out. So actually, if we stay within the Union, I'm afraid that the Scots, who have kind of got a bit of the virus from that type of thinking, who are happy with PR, who don't want to be part of a monolithic United Kingdom, who, as Ian pointed out, have rejected fairly roundly the marketisation of welfare, now have a kind of perception of themselves as a North European kind of state, and will continue to struggle within the United Kingdom to have that manifest. Is that going to be pretty? Nah. I'm not saying that's a good reason to get shot of us, not that it's up to you to decide. But I think should the Scots remain, we will still be those awkward, irritating people who keep raising things that nobody else is very interested in for a while. And there is the possibility that that could gain traction if aspects of English politics are resonant. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Leslie. Well, before going out to take questions from the audience, there's just one issue I wanted to raise myself. I mean, you spoke, Leslie, about the way that aspects of Scottish difference had been retained throughout the Union, the different education and legal system. Ian, you spoke about some of the ways in which, under devolution, difference in underlying social values had been able to be expressed through specific policies, free provision of services and so on. So I just wonder the extent to which you think the current powers have been used to their full extent to enable those differences of values and preferences to be expressed. Because I think something I recall reading in your book, Ian, was actually in certain areas it's quite surprising how power to vary income tax by 3p, the power to change the council tax system. I mean, some of those quite important levers actually haven't been used. So it's just quite an interesting difference of perspective. So Would you like to pick up
So
on
the
that?
extent to which it has actually used the powers. Well, I mean, it has used the powers very effectively, and I think that's indicated by the extent to which Scots were very ambivalent about the Parliament in its early years, particularly when it was beset by scandals like the Parliament building scandal, various expensive scandals which actually predated the scandals that took place down here and partly precipitated them. It was very unpopular in its early years, but it now has established itself pretty much as the centre of public life in Scotland, and people identify with it and they feel that it's worthwhile and it does make a change. And I think Scots were rather approved of this idea of incremental devolution or incremental home rule or incremental independence, whatever you like to call it, because it appeared as if the Scottish Parliament was gradually moving towards a kind of fiscal autonomy, which would be probably as much independence as Scots would wish to have in the United Kingdom. Because as I was trying to say, and as Leslie indicated, the difference between Scotland and Ireland is that Scotland never felt in any sense under a kind of colonial oppression or internal colonialism. Scots don't need national liberation. They've never felt that they're oppressed by England or under the heel of England. It's not been like that. Scots were very much a part of the general enterprise of the British Empire. Scots fought the wars, they ran the colonial trading companies, and they ran the colonial administrations. And this was very much, seen as a joint enterprise. So I think Scots don't particularly want to leave the UK. They're at the moment bemused about what leaving the UK would mean, actually, because the SNP has also adopted this incrementalism, and it says that, in fact, you won't have to leave the UK because it will still be the UK. You can still call yourself British after independence. Alex Salmond talks about these 5 unions which will remain after independence: the defence union, the social union, as he calls it, the European Union, the currency union. So I'm not sure if this is exactly answering your question, but I think that the genius of the Scottish Parliament, as it was devised, as I said, through this constitutional sleight of hand, within a unitary state, the Scottish Parliament was given extraordinary latitude to acquire powers incrementally. I think it's done that extremely well and very effectively. So effectively, I'm afraid that people, in their over-enthusiasm, voted by a landslide for the SNP and precipitated this referendum, which, as I say, no one particularly wants at this moment.
Bit of a stuck record here. Yes, the Scottish Parliament has been creative in its use of its spending powers. I agree with Ian. It's not been in the least creative in its use of its taxing powers. In fact, it has not used them at all. And I draw people's attention to a guy who I think is an outstanding campaigner and outstanding writer by the name of Andy Whiteman, who has a book out there called The Poor Had No Lawyers, which is about, and in matters of land reform, I'm a Lloyd George radical as he is, pointing out the scandal of land taxation and property rights in Scotland, particularly in Scotland, over a very long time. There is a solution at hand for the first courageous political party who would like to stand up and do it, and that is land taxation. It's entirely within the existing powers of the Scottish Parliament. Has there been a cheap about it other than from campaigners? I'm afraid not.
Interesting. And Leslie, do you want to comment on that?
Well, somebody who I did a show with Andy in the Edinburgh Festival last year, and the book has several chapters. I was a trustee of the Isle of Egg Trust, the island that bought itself back from a landowner in 1997, which was an 8-year battle to effectively issue leases to 65 people, which is shocking. It's shocking to think how much effort had to go into attaining what any democracy would think is just a basic right. And I agree with you, Ian, actually, that there are many aspects of life which are not at all hunky-dory in Scotland. 1,000 people still own 60% of the private land in Scotland. That has not been tackled by the SNP government. When it comes to issues of land, however, let's look at how you might look at local taxation. There was a proposal by the SNP to move to a local income tax. At the moment, anything that the SNP proposes, like it's Tuesday today or it's Monday, would be automatically argued by Labour. We are in a gridlock now. It's absolutely impossible to get any sensible policies through, just about, unless they are are the inheritance of Labour from earlier days. So we're at a situation where there could be no agreement reached, and in fact, Armageddon was also predicted for any shift towards local income tax, because that would change too much about the way tax was collected. Having said all that, Andy and quite a number of us have submitted proposals to Ian Davison, in fact, and to the Scottish Affairs Committee, because taxation and how you could change land is still largely controlled by Westminster. So, I mean, in a way, it's absolutely right. There has been tremendously little sort of radical verve. But then, in a funny kind of way, there's been a bit of sort of feeling in Scotland of a kind of, we're out there slightly a bit further than we've been before with control over certain levers, but there's not consensus within the nation about how to tackle what sort of general overall strategy we've got for the future. And this is just the one thing I want to say. I don't know how many people have been through a divorce in the room, but you can either concentrate on who gets the CDs and is it kind of sensible to consider them in isolation from the CD player, or, which is where we are at the moment, a lot of technicalities. Actually, what sits at the bottom of divorce is hurt. And because hurt is not a thing we're very good talking about, we talk about the CDs. Now, you know, in the end, somebody's got to have them. I'm not denying that. And technicalities, I'm not dismissing the entire future of how we will operate as technicalities alone. But the thing people can't talk about is this other thing here, which is, how do we envisage a new Scotland? And clearly, that's a long, endless discussion, because it could be different, perhaps not very different, straight after independence. It would presumably change over time. But because this one is really quite hard to talk about, it's very hard to sort of flesh out. And it must seem to people, what is the point? If you're going to go through all that stramash just to become a fraction different from the English default, why bother doing it? I think that's one at the moment we're still struggling with, and sometimes the debate can seem quite lame, because in addition to not using the tax powers that Ian illustrated, very few politicians in Scotland are going out and colouring in the picture, because it might piss a few people off.
Yeah, well, I think that's been one of the interesting things of the recent conference season, is that SNP's attempt in my impression, to shift the debate more to, this is what we will do with the additional powers, this is how we will diverge further from England in terms of policies and so on. I'd like to go out for questions from the audience now. We'll take a few together. And yes, please say who you are and where you're from. We'll start there.
David Walker, Guardian Public. Is it at all surprising to the panel that here the political and policy-making class have been utterly indifferent, both to the fact of the referendum and to the contours of the United Kingdom that will inevitably change whatever the vote in Scotland next September? There's been no, as it were, Dycean reaction. There's been no embracing of the prospect of a new, flexible United Kingdom. London, the political class, the policymaking class, doesn't care. Is that a matter of any surprise?
Okay, thanks. We'll take another question or two now. Yes, here at the front.
Thank you. John Newham, I teach politics and history, and my question is, we're thinking particularly the latter part of the issue, the future of the UK, regardless of the outcome of the referendum, what are the likely effects upon England, Wales and Northern Ireland? There's so many possibilities. You know, perhaps for an English Parliament, looking again at the Good Friday Agreement, the Welsh wanting a little bit more than they got last year. Could we just get just a little insight? Because obviously the focus is very much upon Scotland. But what about the other three parts of the UK as well? I can't imagine somehow that things will just carry on as if nothing was happening next September. Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions at this point? Or okay, we'll take those two then. So why such indifference down in Westminster, and what happens to the rest of the UK after the referendum? Ian, would you like to start on that?
Okay, I'll work backwards. Looking again at the Good Friday Agreement is the second balmiest idea I've ever heard after devolving corporation tax to Scotland. I think all parties in Northern Ireland and the UK would run a mile away from that. But I think there would be consequences, and I think the place to look for the consequences would be Wales, where, as you probably know, the movement to replace the existing so-called Barnett regime by one which is responsive to needs is at its furthest and its best argued, and I would say that would be the one to watch. Other effects on England, Wales and Northern Ireland I think are mostly bound up in the notorious West Lothian question, about which I don't want to repeat myself. In relation to David Walker's question, am I surprised that the political class is indifferent? I'm afraid not. But of course, I, like my co-panelists, have been banging on about this for years. And I mean, tonight and all the other gigs that we all do are efforts to make the English political class and the English people wake up. The English people, I think, get some wrong ends of some sticks. I mean, insofar as there is popular feeling in England about this, I think it's driven by the flip side of what both my fellow panelists said, which is the fact that Scotland gets more generous welfare provisions in various areas. And undoubtedly there is some growing resentment about that in England, which is reflected in the English counterpart, British social attitudes to the slides I put on. But a lot of this is, I think, if it's not driven by pure envy, and maybe it is, it's driven by inability to understand numerators and denominators. As Scotland is a tenth of the UK population, if you got a financial settlement which meant that the Scots were no longer able to afford zero tuition fees and social care for the elderly, the extra amount of money that would be available per English person is infinitesimal. So insofar as there is English concern, I think it's based on a misunderstanding of the issues.
Yeah, I think answering David's first, I think the lack of interest down here, in some ways it's not surprising. People have their own preoccupations down here, and as I said, Scotland has a very different political culture now, and in many ways it's very different from that in the southeast of England in particular. So people have difficulty understanding and translating Scottish politics. It is remote, it's only 5 million people, it's only a twelfth of the population of the UK, so why should people be particularly concerned about it down here? I think it's also because of this decline in the concept of Britishness, which actually has been more pronounced south of the border than it has been north of the border. Paradoxically, Scots are more interested and have more commitment to the joint enterprise of the UK, which is why they remained in the UK calmly while the oil revenues through the 70s and the 80s were allowed to go south, and Scotland still remains the only state, principality, country or region in the world which has discovered oil and not directly benefited from it. And that, so Scotland did genuinely have a lot of skin in the UK game and still does, has a great deal of affection for it. But down here, I think the idea of Britishness is seen as an anachronism. I think it's the HS2 effect. If this was the 1950s with Howard Macmillan or Harold Wilson in the 60s and they proposed an HS2, a fast rail link, it would have been this great project which is bringing Great Britain together. It's collapsing Britain. It's overcoming the distance. It's showing that you can be in Scotland and England on the same day for a day's work, and that this is bringing us closer together. And there hasn't been any suggestion of that. It's going to start in London and go up maybe to Manchester, and that's about it. So I think that's the question there. As far as south of the border, yeah, an English Parliament, well, it will be an English Parliament, clearly, because the Scots will not be, if there's a yes, Scots will not be there. England will be a much more conservative country because, as Ian indicated, the involvement of some 40 or 50 Scottish MPs in the House of Commons has been to the benefit of the Labour Party in the past. So the Labour Party will have to move significantly to the right to accommodate that. It's already doing that in terms of welfare policy, I think, south of the border. And you will be coming out of Europe, and that's where the ordure does interconnect with the air conditioning, because if the UK goes out of Europe, as I think it inevitably would, Scotland wants to remain in Europe, and then you would start having problems.
Leslie?
Yeah, I am still perhaps surprised at how little interest there is in London, particularly about this. I was down here, in fact, for my fateful encounter with Liverpool Street Station 2 weeks ago for the Battle of Ideas, which is a something that the Institute of Ideas put on. And here we are, a year before what could be the biggest constitutional change in Britain for 300 years longer perhaps. And I was asked to speak about Nordic nations and cycling. And it is a little bit like cycling while Rome burns. I mean, there's something going on, but this is fairly characteristic. Ian and I will both have this experience now. We've both been on any questions, question time sort of things. I was on a fairly extraordinary version of question time, which had 3 Scots. I was one based in Scotland. Had George Galloway drafted in. There's always one entertaining guest. And then at the last moment had Nigel Farage added as well to the panel, so that it was one larger than usual. Now this, if you remember, and I don't know why one would have watched it, because I could hardly bear being in it myself, but this was the one that also had for the first time 16 and 17-year-olds in the audience. Now, as somebody who was a broadcaster, that's enough elements normally for an interesting programme. But I have to say, there was a kind of chronic lack of faith on the part of the programme makers that just what was there could possibly be entertaining enough to where the majority of the audience is, which is the south of England. We're back to that just sheer geographical numerical fact. So the thing had to be tarted up, to put it bluntly. There had to be some kind of confrontation introduced. Actually, it didn't really work because Nigel Farage, as we would say in Scotland, was papping it. And came up beforehand to try and argue that, in fact, UKIP was the English version of the SNP to its English leader, its leader in the Westminster Parliament, Angus Robertson, which was kind of like that argument didn't really work. So it's a weird old one, because it's kind of like here we are getting closer to something which is momentous, and with no momentous feelings surrounding it in anything that reflects from the British media. And there's a problem there, because if any of you travel up and down, you'll be able to see what no one else can, which is that there are 2 versions of everything now. You can have the Sun, for example, banging on about subsidy junkie Scots in its London edition and almost backing independence in its Scottish one. It's almost impossible to see how the other side is experiencing news, because we are actually quite different. You know, as Ian said, when I was thinking about coming on any of those programs, I was having to bone up on stuff we just don't have. We don't have foundation hospitals. We don't have the same structure of the police force. So coming back to this question of kind of, is it shocking or surprising that London doesn't care? I have to be honest, yes it is. And maybe that's the old liberal in me that always hoped that this country would see a federal solution as a useful one, having been the country that enforced it on Germany after the war, to try to make sure that that concentration of power, which had its most extreme and appalling consequences in what happened, never happened again. We understand the dynamics of trying to diffuse structurally, trying to devolve power. We've just never looked at Britain as a good place to do it. So yes, that's surprising. And on this, finally, on this question of the other nations, the other thing that I've noticed is a different use of Britishness. When Britishness is normally talked about in England, it's normally in the context of multiculturalism. When the Scots talk about British, we're boringly banging on about the old Britishness, the Britishness of 4 nations within one state. And actually, we're just like ships passing in the night now, because we're not even talking about the same things when we talk about Britishness. That's how much there is dissonance in the debate.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, more questions. Alan.
Thank you. Alan Evans, Scotland Office and Institute for Government. I go to declare an interest, first of all. I'm the head of the Scotland Office, so unlike sometimes where you have to say I'm an impartial civil servant, on this issue I'm extremely partial. It's my job to be partial in support of the UK government and in support of the Secretary of State, Alistair Carmichael. So I've said that in preference to begin with. But what struck me about what was said is, I think that as Ian McLean made out quite clearly, if you look at the cephology of this, there is a clear majority against independence in Scotland, 2-1, no chance and no suggestion that's moving at the moment. Secondly, on some of the policy issues referred to, currency, EU, tax and spend, welfare and pensions you could have spoken about, there are very clear positions set out by the UK government and very difficult questions for the Scottish government to answer, in my view. But leaving that aside, the one thing that none of the panellists spoke about, and I was very surprised about this, was about the personalities involved and the campaign. And one of the things that history has shown, which was touched upon, is the SNP has a very powerful ability to both confound the polls. It won in 2007 a minority government. Against the odds from 2007 to 11, it managed to stay in power as a minority government. And of course, in 2011, when in a system designed to ensure coalition, it won a majority government. So, I mean, the question I would have is just if people could perhaps crystal ball gaze a bit into the campaign itself. And if you're advising the yes or the no campaign on how they should win the election from the position they're in at the moment, what would it be?
Okay, great. Look forward to the answer on that. But yeah, we've got a question here in the middle.
Alistair Smith, UK Competition Commission. I was struck by one thing that Ian McWhirter said in his introduction about the difference between England and Scotland in relation to NHS reform and schools reform. The Scots aren't interested in doing what successive English governments have tried to do in those areas. Is that because the Scots have got an education system and a health system that is immune to the problems that are motivating the British government to try and change the systems in England? And I'm not arguing that what British government is doing is right or wrong. It is trying to do something because it perceives there being problems. Do these problems not exist in Scotland? Or has Scotland positively decided that it doesn't want to tackle them?
Okay, so that'll be one for you. Any other questions at this point? Okay, I might also just throw in another one, which is following on from what Alan Evans asked. What do we expect the SNP or Scottish Government white paper next month to, or how, to what extent is that likely to change the campaign and the debate at all? Is that likely to clarify a lot of the big uncertainties that the SNP are finding difficult? So, do you want to go first, Ian? Yeah, sure.
Yeah, just addressing the public sector issue. I think Ian would probably say that there isn't so much concern about the NHS north of the border because more is spent on it. And that's partly true, but it's partly also because Scots are more ill and have a whole collection of health problems, which have, and particularly in the west of Scotland, which, as you know, has led to high mortality rates for coronary issues and cancer. Anyway, but I think beyond that, I think there's more to it. I mean, there is for want of a better word, a more communitarian ethos in Scotland. As I say, there's much less, it's much flatter in terms of inequality. You don't have the same extremes of wealth and poverty. You have, very large areas of social deprivation, but you don't have the same degree of wealth. I mean, I was looking in Zoopla as it happened because I was trying to find out where, how to get to Carlton Gardens, and it mentions that one Carlton Gardens is actually flats, and there's 18 flats in Carlton Gardens, and the average cost of the flats there is 6,700,000. I mean, that is just inconceivable in anywhere in Scotland. You don't have that kind of these concentrations of wealth that you have south of the border, which has led to, I think, demand by sections of the middle classes to exit the public provision of services like education. They want to buy their own education, they want to buy their own health. You don't have the same amount of money in Scotland, so people don't particularly want to be buying their own health and buying their own education in the same way as you have down here. But it is underpinned, I think, by a more communitarian ethos. There were attempts, as our colleague from the Scottish office will no doubt recall, under the Labour administrations before 2007, there were attempts to introduce the sort of privatised model from south of the border in Scotland, and it was almost uniformly resisted. And in fact, the only private hospital in Scotland, which was UCI International, was nationalised in Scotland in 2005. So I mean, that's an indication of the lack of intellectual support that there is for the kind of market-based reforms that are happening south of the border. It just doesn't really happen. As for advice to the respective parties, I mean, Alex Salmond, it's often said that Alex Salmond, he comes from behind. He's a great gambler. He was 11 points behind in the Scottish parliamentary elections at this stage, and he won by a landslide, so why couldn't that happen again? And it certainly could happen again, but I think it's unlikely, because there people were voting for a government. Here they're voting for a country, or they would be voting for a country if they knew exactly what it was. People have a very opaque idea of what independence means in Scotland, and that's puzzling them, and that's perplexing a lot of people. I think that's the main reason that you're getting a reluctance to reflect and perhaps contemplate independence. But there's something else in terms of advice. What deeply worries me, it reminded me of that question time that Leslie was on. What I'm most concerned about, and I think which probably will happen as we get closer to the referendum, particularly when the UK press engages with it in the attacking way in which the tabloid press does engage in these issues, there will be a great deal of antagonism, I think. They'll go to Scotland, they'll find idiots who say things about England. They'll go to England and find idiots who say things about Scotland. And then they'll say, oh, this is, it's all about race, or it's all about ethnicity, and it's all about sending English people home from Scotland, which of course is not what it is about at all. And I'm deeply concerned about that. So if I can make any appeal to my colleagues in the Scottish office, it's to resist Project Fear and the whole sort of scare agenda, because it's liable to explode in everybody's faces. It may seem very calm at the moment, but these things could erupt very, very rapidly, I think.
Okay, thanks. Leslie?
Just kind of working backwards on some of those things. It would be nice, would it not, for the Scots to have an ability to compare between options when they go to the polls next year. Now that is kind of fanciful in the extreme. Ian's written about this, suggesting that if Alex Salmond was smart, he would actually call a constitutional convention for next year and try to gather some tangible options. Because, I mean, in a way, the tone of the debate tonight is very much the same as it's been conducted in Scotland, which is actually there are two options for the Scots, staying in the UK or becoming independent, but the one that gets all the detailed scrutiny is this one. Now, that's partly because we think we know this one, but actually it bears some scrutiny too. And it's very possible that a lot of the drive for the Scottish Parliament in the first instance arose from Margaret Thatcher. And that what's happening now in terms of the welfare state is a driver for people, now that they haven't got the option of going for Devo Max or Devo anything in between, folk are being polarised by the two options that will be on the ballot paper. So in many respects, one of the greatest recruiting sergeants for independence is the current UK government. Now, where that leaves you, if you're going to stay within the United Kingdom, is not a tremendously active issue, much as the SNP have tried to make it one, because the direction of all the questioning is to constantly question, which is quite fair, how will you have an army, how will you have a currency, whatever. Now, actually, what sort of currency will the UK have? Will the UK be in the European Union? Never mind whether Scotland gets in or not. There are many of the same questions about the uncertainty of the near future, which attend on the other option. And let's face it, despite dropping kind of pregnant hints that there would be some more crumbs on offer for the Scots, should they vote no, there's been nae beef. I mean, what actually does that mean? And so, in the same way as one could say, well, what does any in-between solution look like from the Scottish point of view? Well, has anybody offered it tangibly from the Westminster point of view? Now, people might want to get to the stage when they're voting next year, and this, I appreciate, in our system, is so laughingly naive that it just kind of makes me feel like the age of 12 to say it. But wouldn't it be nice if people could actually have sorted out options when they came to vote that were roughly like what people intended to offer? Now, call me mad, but that's sitting there as a grown-up way of behaving, which I would love to think those involved would be confident enough to roll out for Scotland. And again, move away from trying to capitalise on this ability to raise endless hairs which can't be answered by one side without providing any sort of detail on the other one.
Actually, I wonder if I could just throw it back to the civil servant from the Scotland office. It's very candid about your political commitment to one side of this debate, which is something I assure you the Scottish government civil servants would never express in a public forum. But what do you think when you hear your political masters talking about these new options for greater powers to the Scottish Parliament and a new constitutional future? What do you have in your mind when they talk about that? Do you have a clear idea of a plan B of what happens after a no vote?
I've the advantage of not being on the panel actually at the moment, but I don't know if I answer that question. But the point is on the referendum, there is only one question. That's what ministers from the UK and the Scottish Government decided. Now, people can talk about any other questions they want to, but actually there's only one.
Yeah, so
Why the debate
there would be no plan B.
Well, let's move on from that. Thanks for answering that, Alan. Ian, do you want to pick up on any of those issues, or can Alex Salmond still turn it round in the campaign? And also this issue I raised of we're expecting a white paper in a month or so that's supposedly going to answer a lot of these questions people are asking about what this might mean.
So very quickly, can he turn it around? Yes, he can, I agree. His best strategy is to ensure that David Cameron and George Osborne make as many visits to Scotland as they can, but they may be too wise to oblige him there. On what will the white paper contain? Well, I wish we knew, and one of the points on which I disagree with Ian is on this threat that we both mentioned from the UK government that Scottish membership of a currency union, an independent Scotland's membership of a currency union with the UK would be on conditions which the rest of the UK government would set. Ian describes that as a ridiculous threat. I think it's an extremely credible threat because the rest of the UK government is the government of the rest of the UK, and it will absolutely want to impose stiff deficit and debt terms on a Scottish government before it would admit it to a common currency. And that's one of the questions that I really hope to see the Scottish government's answer to. Now, Ian said that the banks would put pressure on the UK government not to go down that road. I think there's a simpler answer from the fact that the banks do 90% of their business in the rest of the UK. For regulatory purposes, RBS and what's left of HBOS and the insurance companies, Scottish Widows, Standard Life, for regulatory purposes, they will relocate in the rest of the UK. They may not move their head offices, but for regulatory purposes, they will relocate. On the other question, if I can very quickly, is there no pressure to reform health or education in Scotland? I largely, but not totally, agree with Ian. Sure, I agree with the points about Scotland being more egalitarian in some respects. We don't have the problem of, as I also see it, of private schools. Sorry, we Scots. On the other hand, if you measure it by outputs, is the output of Scottish education so much better than that of English? There's not strong evidence on that from the international PISA tables. The outcomes of Scottish health are unquestionably worse in spite of more being spent on it. So the fact that there is no great political pressure to reform in these areas, for me, comes down to a point which Ian also mentioned, that there's no pressure to reform them because at present they can fund them at the existing level. They can, therefore they do.
Okay, thank you. Do we have any final questions? Yes. Oh, good. Jill, here, my colleague.
In economics, there's a concept of optimal currency union, which is one of the sort of tests for things like the euro and things like that. I just wondered whether we were getting to a sort of situation of unsustainable political union, because it struck me that notwithstanding quite a lot of the points that Ian McLean was making about why this wouldn't work, a lot of the things you're suggesting, for example, that the worst thing David Cameron and George Osborne could do would go to Scotland, suggests that actually we're getting to a situation where whatever you might want, is it actually feasible in the long run to maintain a political union with both Scotland and England in it?
Okay, I think there are a couple more over here. Yes. So we'll take them both. If you could keep them very quick, as we're nearly out of time, please.
My question was about the future of the SNP, depending on either a yes or a no vote. If there's a no vote, do the panel think that would result in any kind of infighting or a leadership challenge or anything like that? And if there's a yes vote, how you think they might fight the first independent Scottish elections as a single party, or would there be any sort of breakaway groups, and what your sort of sense of that is?
Okay, and finally over here, please.
Thank you. Roger Goff, Kent County Council and formerly of the Conservative Party's Democracy Task Force. Going back to David Walker's question about why the London political and media class is so uninterested in all this, I would suggest one part of it is that so far over the period, and as some extent the panel have said, is that Scotland has been able to carve out its own identity in a way that has no feedback effects on the rest of the British political system. So in a sense it can be sort of out of sight, out of mind. Question is, if we get a no, but then a big move towards particularly further fiscal devolution, how much longer can we go on without it having any feedback effects back onto particularly the way things are done in England? Or does it simply or do we simply continue this rather anomalous situation?
Okay, great. So, yeah, the final three questions. I'll start with Leslie, and if you've got any final comments, please make them at this point, but relatively briefly if possible.
I think the anomaly will continue because, you know, why shouldn't it? I'm just still surprised that there's not been a head of steam since 2004 for any discussion about English devolution. But as long as that doesn't exist, there's no way that the Scots are going to trigger it. So I suspect that won't happen. The SNP will get straight back on the horse and try and argue for as good a deal as they possibly can should there be a no vote. And that gives a very good focus. So I can't actually see too much argument about that, although dear knows, you know, there could be quite a lot jostling. When Alex Salmond decides to call it a day, that will be an interesting moment because his anointed heir is Nicola Sturgeon, but he came back into politics partly because at a previous leadership election it looked like she might lose. Now her position is a lot stronger now, but then, you know, there's still sugar room in that one. That's a very good question. I think this is, if we can get round to just generally speaking, can we keep a political union? Well, you can, because there's 55 million of you, there's 5 million of us. So this can go on and on and on, because none of the examples we've cited, or at least in the Nordics, have anything like that disparity of population. So the recipe is there for this to go on and on, unless there is some acknowledgement that there needs to be room for genuine diversity. And the last thing I'd like to say is, much as everybody loves the narrative of Alex Salmond being the kind of wizard from Oz, or Mick Oz, who can keep pulling rabbits out of hats every election, and what will he do next? My greatest concern about this whole campaign is that I think Scots are not looking at the independence question by trying to assess the capacity of Alex Salmond. They're assessing the capacity of one another. Because, I mean, if we're going for independent country, Alex Salmond is one guy. You know, if this is going to be an elite, top-down, party-driven movement, and when the Catalan leader came over, he was at first envious of the fact that the British government had given the Scots the chance to have this referendum. He went home saying, do you know, we at least can pave the pavements from Barcelona right up into the hills with people who want independence. 70% backing, grassroots support. We'll get there. Now, that's what the Scots haven't got. And the longer the narrative is full of what foo-foo dust will Alex Salmond come out with next, the more it distracts again from that larger question, which is, why are we the sick man of Europe? Why have we left feudalism in place? Why are we actually set to become the 8th most unequal country in the world if we were to become independent? Those are the elephants in the room, and Scots aren't stupid. We know no government has tackled it, and the SNP have been no different. So I think a bit of that's mixing my metaphors far too much, but making hay while the sun shone in the terms of dealing with some of these things would have perhaps suggested to Scots we have the capacity to deal with these unmentionable difficulties which otherwise act as a drag on confidence and on the likely economic progress of a new country.
Okay, thanks. Ian.
Yeah, just in reverse order. I mean, I think the, as things stand, you know, it would be quite possible for two countries to diverge in all sorts of ways. I think it is unfortunate this referendum has happened. I think we can see what will happen if there's a no vote, as we've heard from the Scotland office. No will mean no. There will be no sort of further concessions. In fact, it will be quite the reverse. There will be a reduction in the number of Scottish MPs, a reduction in Scottish representation in Westminster. There will be quite significant cuts, I think, in Scottish public spending, because what will happen is that the taxation will be devolved, but not the taxation of oil revenues. So you will then have an artificial deficit being created in Scotland, which can only be met by public spending cuts. And I think that will cause quite a bit of resentment. And so, I mean, if there's a no vote, I think the SNP will very likely win the 2016 Scottish parliamentary elections, if nothing else, because Scots will want to hedge their bets. And if they have voted to stay in the UK, they'll want people who will try and put some pressure on the UK not to go down that kind of punitive road. If there's a yes, I don't think people say that the SNP would, some people would suggest the SNP would just pack up, because what's the point? It's all about independence, and you've got independence, so they would all go off and form a Tory party or be in the Labour Party in Scotland or something like that. I think that's probably not what will happen. More like Ireland, have a kind of Fine Gael and a Fine Gael, who are two parties who, you know, have their origins in the Irish Civil War, but everyone's forgotten about, and they will just continue to be sort of centres of, you know, political power, patronage, the usual way that political parties work. And when it works back on England, I think probably will be over Europe, because I think there's every possibility that, you know, that I think Britain, or England at any rate, its trajectory is out of Europe, because the proposal is to radically renegotiate the terms of our membership of the EU, which are, I don't see that there's much scope for that. But Ed Miliband is moving now. He's expected to agree that there should be an in-out referendum. I think there will be an in-out referendum. And I think in England, you would probably vote to leave Europe. And that could create, you know, considerable tensions, working back to what we were saying before, because you have these divergences of political culture. So I go back. I rather provocatively said that there would be more changes if there's a no vote. And actually, the more I think about it, the more I think that's probably right.
Okay, thanks. And final comments from you, Ian.
Okay, final comments. I don't know if Jill wanted the literal question of an optimal currency union to be taken up. I think that, there's some work on this, and I think probably it is fairly optimal. On the other hand, I think the Scottish Government has delivered itself a weak bargaining hand. I won't repeat myself on that. A political union. Yeah, political union, well, Canada may be impossible, but it sort of continues, and I can envisage something rather similar happening in the UK. But I'll just pick up one point which might be an indirect answer to how would I advise the Yes campaign. And it is that Ian said something totally extraordinary and nobody blinked an eyelid. So I'll just try the implications. Ian said, probably the boats will stay in Fastlane, but the warheads will go to Aldermaston, which is, of course, where they are at present prepared. So that means that once a year or something, an armed warhead or two will be driven 400 miles from Aldermaston to Fastlane through the middle of Glasgow, or if not the middle of Glasgow, the middle of Stirling.
At the moment.
Well,
they travel every year. They travel down to the atomic weapons.
Yeah, but they can't. They couldn't be stored in an armed state. On your
I
scenario.
think this is getting too technical.
But it is my contribution. It's my contribution to the Yes campaign. I'm sure they thought of it themselves. That if this is the sort of Scotland that you want to see, fine, you can vote no. If not, vote yes.
Okay, thanks. So on that note, I think we'll bring a very lively debate to a close and just ask you all to, before hopefully joining us for drinks and canapes, just thanking the three speakers in the usual way.